Hello and welcome to this Sophos Certified Training course for Sophos XG Firewall. This is Module 5, Authentication. The Sophos XG Firewall is an identity-based firewall that allows you to build policies around users rather than just networks or devices. To make this possible, the XG attaches an identity to traffic that is passing. In this module, we will look at both local and external authentication, the different types of users on the XG firewall, how users can be authenticated, and how to use a user's identity once they have authenticated. The XG firewall has a local user database where users can be manually created or imported via a CSV. Users can be created as either a user or administrator, and for administrators, a profile can be selected that controls the level of access. Local users can be manually assigned to a group which they will inherit policy settings. These can be overridden per user. Policy settings include network and internet restrictions, traffic shaping, and remote access VPN settings. Local authentication is best suited to organizations that are small in size and do not have an existing directory service in place, or when guest users need access in authentication-enabled networks. The Sophos XG firewall can also be configured to authenticate with external servers such as Active Directory, Novell eDirectory, LDAP or LDAP-S, the Radius server, and TACACS Plus. Using LDAP or LDAP-S, Sophos XG Firewall can authenticate using OpenLDAP, Apple Directory, or any other standard LDAP directory. As the Sophos XG Firewall is an identity-based firewall, authentication is essential. Authentication is done at different levels depending on the type of access, and there are 3 types of authentication depending on the current situation. Authentication in the firewall is the general form of authentication, and the most common, in which the users are authenticated through the firewall. By choosing the servers in this group, you are telling the firewall that users authenticating through the firewall, mostly to access the internet or internal resources, will be coming from the list of selected authentication servers. Authentication servers will be processed from top to bottom in the selected authentication server list, and servers can be reordered by dragging and dropping the servers in the list. This can also be done for VPN and administrator authentication access. For the other services, you can set the authentication to mirror the firewall authentication methods so they do not have to be separately defined. In the admin configuration section, the selected users are allowed to log into the web console of the Sophos XG firewall. In a small organization, a local user can be created. However, for a large organization, if a local user is created, it means the user has to remember 2 sets of credentials. To ease this, administrator authentication allows users from an external directory to access the web console. The XG firewall has 3 types of users. Standard users that authenticate with a username and password. They can be authenticated locally by the XG firewall or using an external authentication server such as Active Directory. Clientless users do not authenticate using a username and password, but instead are identified purely by their IP address. Clientless users are always authenticated locally by the XG firewall. Typically, you would use clientless users to control network access for servers or devices such as printers and VoIP phones. The final type of user is a guest user. These are users that are given temporary network access, usually to access the internet. They authenticate with a username and password that are generated by the XG firewall and are always authenticated locally. Here, you can see an example of a print server being added as a clientless user. You give the device a name, specify the IP address, and select which group they will be a member of. You will use the group in the firewall rules to then control the network access the device has. Clientless users can also be added in bulk by specifying a range of IP addresses and selecting which group they will be a member of. You can edit the details for each IP address after adding them. Here, you can see two clientless users. The top user was added as part of a range, and the bottom user was added singly. Here, you can see two guest users that have been added to an XG firewall. Similarly to clientless users, you can add guest users individually or in bulk. This is useful if there are guests that need access for an extended period of time, such as a contractor that will be doing work with the company but will not have an account in the domain. There are two main options when adding guest users: how long their credentials will be valid for, and whether the time will start as soon as the user is added or when the user first logs on. Once added, the guest user's details can be printed. This can be done in bulk by selecting multiple users and clicking Print. All guest users are created with the same settings that can be configured in Configure Authentication Guest User Settings. Here, you can set the group that the user will be added to and the password complexity. Optionally, you can also integrate the XG firewall with an SMS gateway to allow guest users to register for their own access details. This can save significant time where there are large volumes of guest users, such as in hotels and airports. Now that we've looked at the different types of users, we'll look at groups. There are two types of groups, normal and clientless, for their respective user types. A group is a collection of users with common policies and can be used to assign access to resources for a number of users in one step. Instead of attaching individual policies to the user, create a group with defined policies and simply assign the appropriate group to the user. The user will automatically inherit all of the policies added to the group. This simplifies user configuration. A group can contain default as well as custom policies. Examples of policies that can be grouped include surfing quotas, access times, network traffic, and traffic shaping. These are configured in System Profiles. You should note that by default, users will inherit their assigned group's policies. To adjust a group's assigned policies, select a policy from the list of available policies while editing or creating a new group. You can also create a new policy directly from the group page. In the case of SSL VPNs, if a user does not have access to the SSL VPN, then select No Policy Applied. Users are automatically created on the Sophos XG firewall when they first successfully log in. When the firewall creates the user, it will synchronize additional properties from the Active Directory server, including the full name and email address. The firewall can also assign the user to the same groups that they are a member of in Active Directory if those groups have been imported before the user logs in. Groups can be easily imported using the Import Group wizard. Note, the XG firewall does not support nested groups, and if a user is a member of multiple groups, they will be added to the first one they match. This simulation will show you how to import groups from Active Directory. Review the information at each stage, and then click in the green box to advance to the next slide. The Sophos XG firewall supports 5 main methods for authenticating users. These are hotspot, clientless users, single sign-on, authentication agent, and captive portal. This is the order in which authentication is checked for users. Hotspot authentication is checked when a hotspot is active on the interface the traffic is coming from. The Authentication Agent client can be downloaded from the user portal. Once installed, the user can enter their credentials and save them so that it will authenticate with the firewall every time they log in. Please note that the Authentication Agent must be installed for each user that logs into a device. By default, it is not installed for all users. The XG firewall has several methods for authenticating users for single sign-on. The Sophos Transparent Authentication Suite, or STAS, is installed on domain controllers and reports logon events to the XG firewall. Sophos Authentication for Terminal Client, or SATC, is installed on terminal servers and allows the XG firewall to identify users based on the source port of the traffic from the terminal server. The SSO client enables users to log on to the organization's network as well as to the device simultaneously. This requires client installation on the user's Windows computer. When users are connected to the XG firewall through a remote access VPN, they are automatically authenticated with the firewall seamlessly. Please note that in the case of HA failover, users will have to reconnect to the VPN tunnel as they will be disconnected and the user will be logged out of the firewall. The Sophos XG firewall can transparently authenticate users who have already been authenticated on an external Radius server. The firewall does not interact with the Radius server, but simply monitors Radius accounting records that the server sends. These records generally include the user's IP address and user group. The XG firewall also supports single sign-on for web traffic using NTLM authentication requests. If the user has not been authenticated with the XG firewall using any of the other methods, a captive portal can be displayed. The captive portal can be used by computers and mobile devices and provides a secure portal for user authentication over HTTPS. The captive portal behavior is configured in Configure Authentication Services. Here, you can also choose whether web protection notification pages should include a link to the captive portal. The look of the captive portal can be fully customized in Configure Authentication Captive Portal. Note, the captive portal runs on port 8090. Where authentication is only required for web filtering and the user does not need to be authenticated with the firewall, NTLM authentication can be a simple option. To use NTLM authentication, an Active Directory authentication server needs to be configured on the XG firewall. And to avoid users seeing pop-ups, we would recommend configuring the XG firewall as an explicit proxy. Note, using NTLM authentication will only authenticate users for web traffic. Once you have added an Active Directory authentication server, all you need to do is enable NTLM for the zones the client will be connecting from. To avoid clients seeing a pop-up for authentication, the clients can be configured to use the XG as an explicit proxy. The proxy server address should be the internal hostname that is within the domain. The default proxy port is 3128, but this can be customized in Protect Web General Settings. The Sophos Transparent Authentication Suite, or STAS, provides reliable, transparent SSO authentication for network users without requiring a client on the endpoint. It employs an agent on the Microsoft Active Directory domain controller that monitors and stores authentication activity and exchanges authentication information with the XG firewall, making user-based policy enforcement easy. The STAS software must be installed on all domain controllers to ensure that all logon events can be monitored. It is important to note that the STAS software only works with Microsoft Active Directory and only works with IPv4. Note, the SSO client cannot be used when STAS is enabled on the XG firewall. Let's have a look at how STAS works. The user John Smith logs into the domain on his computer that has the IP address 10.1.1.1. The domain controller writes the login details to the security event log with ID 4768. This includes the IP address of the computer and the name of the user that logged in. Note that in Windows 2003, the event ID is 672. The live users can be found in Monitor and Analyze, Current Activities, Live Users. As STAS is monitoring the event logs, you need to ensure that successful logout events are being audited in the local security policy. STAS, which is installed on the domain controller, monitors the event logs for login events. When a login event is detected, the STAS records the details. STAS notifies XG Firewall of the login and supplies the details recorded from the event log. This is done on port 6060. The XG Firewall updates the live users, mapping the traffic from 10.1.1.1 to the user John Smith. To get started with the Sophos Transparent Authentication Suite, the STAS software can be downloaded from the web admin at Configure, Authentication, Client Downloads, and installed on an Active Directory domain controller. During the installation, you can choose to install just the collector or agent component of STAS or both. STAS also needs to be configured with a user that will be used to run the service. The user must have the right to log on as a service and must be able to monitor the security event log. The service account should be added to the backup operators and event log readers groups in AD, and the local administrators group on endpoints. This can be done via a group policy and is required for WMI logoff detection to work. The account should also be granted Logon as a Service permission on the domain controller and full NTFS permissions on the STAS folder. Once installed, the STAS software needs to be configured. On the General tab, configure the domain that STAS will be monitoring logon events for. On the STA Agent tab, configure the networks for which logon events will be monitored. Here, you can see we are monitoring logon events for the 172.16.16.0/24 and 192.168.16.0/24 networks. If a user logs in from another network, 10.1.1.0/24 for example, this logon will not be forwarded to the XG firewall. The IP address of the XG firewall needs to be added to the Sophos Appliances section of the Sophos Transparent Authentication Suite. Workstation polling can be configured to use either WMI, this is the default option, or registry read access. This is used to determine the currently logged on user when a computer is not found in the live users table. STAS can also be configured to detect when users log off. This can be done using the same method as workstation polling. This is the default option, or ping. Once the STAS software is installed and configured, STAS needs to be enabled on the XG firewall. This is done in Configure, Authentication, STAS. Switch STAS on, then click Activate STAS. You can optionally enable and configure user inactivity handling by setting the inactivity timer and data transfer threshold. You need to add every server that you have installed the collector on in the XG firewall. On the Add New Collector page, enter the IP address and port for the collector, and select whether to create a new group for the collector, or if you already have a collector, add it to an existing group. Here, you can see the collector we have added. Now that we have looked at how to authenticate users with the XG firewall, let's see how this can be used. As we have already seen, there are three types for firewall rules on the XG firewall: network rules, user rules, and business application rules. User rules are exactly the same as network rules, except they are also matched to a user's identity. This option is enabled by default when you create a new network user rule. You can then select the users and groups for the rule to be applied to. If the XG firewall is unable to match the user's identity, you can choose to show the captive portal to allow them to authenticate themselves. If the firewall rule is for business applications such as Office 365 or Salesforce, you can choose to exclude the traffic from data accounting, which means that it will not count towards any quotas you have configured. The Sophos XG firewall supports two-factor authentication using one-time passwords. Two-factor authentication means that you provide two pieces of information to log in: something you know, your password, and something you have, your token. There are different types of The user portal allows users to manage their own quarantine, password, and internet usage, as well as download VPN and authentication clients. The user portal is accessed using HTTPS to the IP address of the firewall. By default, the user portal is only available to clients connecting from the LAN zone, but it can also be enabled for other zones. Please note that the port for the user portal can be changed in System, Administration, Admin Settings. The Sophos XG firewall supports two-factor authentication using one-time passwords. Two-factor authentication means that you provide two pieces of information to log in: something you know, your password, and something you have, your token. There are different types of one-time password. The XG firewall supports time-based one-time passwords. You can use either software tokens, such as the Sophos Authenticator app or Sophos Mobile Security app that are available for Android and iOS, or hardware tokens, as long as they conform to RFC 6238. Note that RSA tokens are not supported. The XG firewall can use one-time passwords to improve the security of the web admin, user portal, including the clientless VPN portal, and SSL and IPsec remote access VPNs. One-time passwords can either be enabled for all users or a selected set of users and groups. Let's take a look at how the OTP authentication works. In this diagram, we have the user with their token on the left and the XG firewall on the right. The user has a token that contains a key and gets the time from a synchronized clock. These are processed using the algorithm described in RFC 6238 to produce the token code. The XG firewall needs to have the same key and be synchronized to the same clock so that when it calculates the token code, it comes out with the same number. To allow for variations in the time between the token and the XG firewall, it will accept the previous and next token code as valid by default. This is the token offset step and can be changed in the settings. Let's start off by looking at the settings for one-time passwords. One-time passwords are not enabled by default and have to be turned on. As we mentioned, one-time passwords can be enabled for all users or a specific set of users and groups. You can choose to have the XG firewall automatically generate a token secret or key when users try to authenticate and they don't have one. XG-generated secrets can be used with software tokens. Hardware tokens need to be added manually. Here, you can select the users and groups to enable one-time passwords for. This is only visible if one-time passwords are not enabled for all users. In this section, you can select which facilities you want to secure with one-time passwords. Finally, you can configure the global token settings. For example, if you are using a hardware token with a 60-second time step, you can configure this here. You can also configure the passcode offset steps, which we discussed in the previous slide. To add a token, you simply need to specify the secret, which is a 32 to 120 character hex string, and select which user to assign the token to. Optionally, the global time step can be overridden, which may be necessary if you are using a mixture of tokens. Here we can see a token for Lisa Fox. There are two scenarios we are going to consider. First, Lisa Fox is on the road, but she has dropped and broken her mobile phone that has the Sophos Authenticator app on it. She needs to access the SSL VPN, but it is secured using OTP. If this happens, you can add additional codes to the token. These are a set of single-use codes that will automatically be removed after they are used. In the second scenario, Lisa has her token, but the login is failing. This might be caused if the time of the token and XG firewall are out of sync. To resolve this, you can enter the current passcode into the XG firewall and it can compensate for the time difference. Now let's take a look at how tokens can be automatically generated for users. When a user logs into the user portal for the first time, after one-time passwords have been enabled, the XG firewall will generate and display the information they need to configure a software token. In most cases, this can be done automatically by scanning the QR code with an app, such as the Sophos Authenticator app. Once the token is configured, the user clicks Proceed to Login. The user will then be presented with the user portal login again. If the user's password is Sophos and the current token code is 436867, then the user will log in using the password Sophos 436867. Complete the following tasks in Lab 5. Task 5.1, configure an Active Directory authentication server. Task 5.2, configure single sign-on using STAS. Task 5.3, user-based policies. And Task 5.4, one-time passwords. Prior to completing these tasks, you must have completed all steps up to the end of Lab 4, Task 4.2. On completion of this module, you should now be able to perform the actions shown here. Please take a moment to review these. If you are not confident that you have met these objectives, please review the material covered in this module. Click Continue when you are ready to proceed. Now that you have completed this module, you should complete Module 6, Web Protection and Application Control.